Out of all of America's 50 states, Hawaii is arguably its most unique. It's the only state to be geographically located outside of the North American continent. It's America's most recent state, having only been admitted to the Union in August of 1959. It is by far the most ethnically diverse state and the only state where Asian Americans make up the single largest ethnic group. It's the most expensive state to live in the country, and, most notably, it is the only state made up of an archipelago that consists entirely of islands. And because of that, as you'd expect, transportation throughout Hawaii works very differently than it does in other states because of the population being divided across all these different islands. The Hawaiian archipelago is made up of 137 different islands, but there's really only 4 of them that have significant numbers of people, and people very rarely travel between the islands by boat. In fact, the only regularly scheduled ferry service at all in Hawaii today just operates between the relatively nearby islands of Maui and Lanai. And that's it. Instead, if you ever want to travel between any other islands in the Hawaiian archipelago, your only realistic option is to fly between them. And so, virtually all travel between Hawaii's main islands is dominated by very short-haul flights run through carriers like Hawaiian Airlines. And this situation appears rather puzzling at first glance, because ferries and maritime transit are a very common and popular form of transportation across several other archipelagic parts of the world, including in many areas that have significantly smaller population bases than Hawaii even has. Take the Aegean Sea, for example, where there are dozens and dozens of Greek ferries that service dozens of islands and locations across the whole region, including many ferries that service very small islands with negligible populations but which have very large tourism interest. So why does Hawaii essentially not have any ferry service at all compared to all of these other examples? And why is it that in order to travel between the Hawaiian Islands, you nearly always have to fly rather than take a boat? First of all, it's important to note that Hawaii has actually had large-scale ferry services between their major islands in the past, but they've all failed for a complex list of reasons that largely has to do with the nature of Hawaii's unique geography and population patterns. The most serious attempt at establishing a reliable ferry service connecting Hawaii's major islands together was called the Hawaii Superferry throughout the decade of the 2000s, and it was one hell of a fiasco. Planning for the Superferry began in 2001 by a private company that sought to offer up an alternative way from the airlines to travel between the Hawaiian Islands that would be quick, cheap, and most importantly, would enable people to easily transport their own personal vehicles and belongings between the islands as well. In 2004, the company signed a contract with a shipyard in Alabama to build out the first 2 of their Hawaiian ferries for a total sum of $178 million, or $89 million apiece, which inflated to 2024 dollars, was about $332 million for the 2 of them. A few years later, by 2007, the Hawaii Superferry was finally ready to begin launching its master plan that envisioned regularly scheduled ferry service between all 4 of Hawaii's majorly populated islands. But the company almost immediately began encountering significant difficulties. First up, there were numerous environmental concerns and risks brought up surrounding the ferry in court. Many of the ferry routes between the islands crisscrossed over well-established and mapped-out routes of humpback whale migration paths, which led to concerns that the huge sizes of the ferries could impact and kill whales and cause other environmental destruction for Hawaii's unique marine life ecosystem. And more pressingly, there was the concern that the ferries could spread invasive species throughout the rest of Hawaii as well. As a series of geographically isolated islands far removed from the rest of the world, Hawaii's ecosystem is uniquely delicate and fragile, and the state is by far the most serious about invasive species in the country. The biggest fear was that ferries loading up people's personal vehicles could accidentally transport these kinds of invasive species between the islands far easier than people flying between them on airplanes could. It also didn't help that by the time the ferry finally began its operation between Oahu and Maui in 2007, they still hadn't completed an environmental impact statement that was required by Hawaii state law. The Hawaii Supreme Court eventually ruled that the Superferry could continue its operation while the environmental impact statement was busy being prepared. But that did little to halt the torrent of environmental lawsuits being dumped on the company, which steadily increased the company's litigation costs and made it increasingly difficult for them to remain financially afloat. And if all of that wasn't enough, the Superferry idea was hitting many other roadblocks as well. As it turned out, another major problem for ferries in Hawaii was the fact that the waters around the islands are notoriously rough. Because of the distances between the main islands covering 100 nautical miles or more, the journeys on the Superferry between the islands would last for 6 to 8 hours, or in some cases even longer, through waters that were often very rough, meaning that seasickness was a common ailment among passengers traveling aboard. If you were a resident of Hawaii and you wanted to travel from one island to another island, you could opt to take the ferry, which might take you up to 8 hours to complete. It might result in you getting severely seasick along the way, and because it would take you another 8 hours or so to get back to your home island, you couldn't really make a day trip out of the ferry journey, so once you get to the other island, you would need to compete with all of the tourists for a hotel for the night, which adds on to the costs and practicality of the ferry journey even more. When you factor all of that in, and then you consider that a round-trip flight between the islands is often only a little more than $100, and takes less than an hour each way, the price of flying between the islands is often cheaper and faster and less likely to make you sick. Without any natural resources or industries outside of tourism and the military, and with the military really only interested in the island of Oahu and none of the others, the result is that the Hawaiian state government has to fund itself primarily through taxes rather than natural resource revenue like Alaska. And so, if the Hawaii state government wants to begin heavily subsidizing a prospective unprofitable ferry service the same way that Alaska does, the only way it would be able to do so would be by increasing taxes in the state even higher than they already are, which would make the cost of living crisis in the state, already the worst in the entire country, even worse than it already is. For all intents and purposes, that is all why a ferry service between the main Hawaiian islands doesn't currently exist, and why one isn't likely to exist in the future either. Until ferry vessel technology and legal reforms advance enough to carry passengers between 2 points much faster and for a much lower cost than they currently can, the low market demand for the use of a ferry in Hawaii and the likelihood of a ferry service in Hawaii succeeding are each likely to continue remaining very low. And after the massive financial disaster the last time that someone tried getting one up and running with the Hawaii Superferry in the 2000s, nobody is likely to try getting another one up and running in Hawaii for the foreseeable future. And the only way you'll be able to travel between the islands for the most part, unless you want to charter or bring your own boat, will be to fly between them instead.